hope is that that same potential they would show if you left that embryo intact and allowed her to develop normally, that the cells in the dish would show that same potential. Now, the potential is to make every type of bodily tissue, but what you find in the dish is you're missing all of those normal developmental cues that we have during those 9 months in the womb. And instead, what you get is what looks like a tumor in the dish.
Welcome to Caring for Both, a curbside consult series by the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or APLOG. On this podcast, we bring on experts to provide insights to support medical professionals in their life-affirming practice and career. I'm Miriam Diallo, I'm APLOG's Communications Manager, and I'm excited to be hosting this episode today with Dr. David Prentice, an internationally recognized expert on the topic of stem cell research, cell biology, and bioethics. Dr. Prentice holds a PhD in biochemistry and has almost 50 years' experience as a scientific researcher and professor, including positions such as Senior Fellow of Life Sciences at the Family Research Council, Professor of Life Sciences at Indiana State University, and Adjunct Professor of Molecular Genetics at the John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University of America. Among many other achievements, he is a founding member of the Midwest Stem Cell Therapy Center, a comprehensive stem cell center in Kansas, and an advisory board member for the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. Today, Dr. Prentice and I will be discussing 3 myths about stem cell research. Dr. Prentice, thank you so much for joining us today.
So good to be with you today.
Of course. Thank you so much. And before we jump into these 3 myths, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your work with stem cells?
Sure thing. Well, I'm a 5th-generation Kansan, farm boy. Grew up in Kansas. Went to the University of Kansas. Got my degree in biochemistry, as you've already mentioned. Did kind of the normal professor things for a while, but then started getting questions about what are these stem cell things they're talking about, and what about cloning and other sorts of weird science things that came up. And I'd actually been working with adult stem cells in my laboratory at Indiana State University, some very simple experiments. My students enjoyed it because I was the experimental animal. They would draw some blood and we'd isolate the adult stem cells from my blood. So trying to just look at what sorts of things you could do with adult stem cells. Could they form other kinds of tissues and so on? And then I started seeing all these news articles about, stem cells, and they meant embryonic stem cells. We're going to, as one U.S. Senator told me, cure all known maladies. And I started to look, though, at the science and go, wait, that's not right. So I started speaking up, and I had a friend who actually was elected to Congress, and he would ask questions, started getting involved in all of those debates, and kind of got neck deep in a lot of what was going on in terms of the science as well as the ethics of stem cell research.
Oh, that's really fascinating. That sounds like a really exciting journey. Let's backtrack a little bit, just to give an overview to any of our listeners who might need a refresher. What are stem cells and what are they used for?
Great question and starting place, because there are actually several different kinds of stem cells. And the stem cell term generically is a cell that is flexible. You might think about sort of a blank slate is what some people use as a term. The idea that they could, with the right signals, form different types of tissue and potentially repair all sorts of types of tissues. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but the basic types of stem cells available: embryonic, which comes from young human embryos, versus adult stem cells. And you actually don't have to be 21 years of age to own an adult stem cell. We're born with them in our body tissues and so on, and their umbilical cord blood and so on. But both of these types of stem cells, and there's another one we'll come to later, they have a flexibility that they can form different types of tissue or repair different types of tissue. And they will continue to grow and divide. So you've got a source of those cells available that then can be used in various ways, is the hope, for especially treating diseases and injuries.
Wow, that's it's really fascinating, and obviously, there's a lot of myths circulating around what stem cells can and can't be used for, or have and haven't been used for. So let's maybe dive into those and see what the responses to those myths are. So the first one, and people will probably have already discerned the answer to this question just from what you've said already. But a lot of people, when they think of stem cell research, they're thinking embryonic stem cells. So, do only embryos have stem cells?
And we already gave away that answer, but the answer is no. But embryonic were definitely the focus. That was the one that made the news. And in fact, uh, in terms of some of the debates in the late 1990s, early 2000s, anytime somebody would say stem cell, a lot of times they were talking about embryonic stem cells. That's what was being pushed, especially politically, and in terms of trying to get money for research from NIH, get those big grants so they could play in the lab. But as we've already said, there are other types of stem cells. Adult stem cells, as I mentioned, you can get from various tissues and organs in your body, from umbilical cord blood, bone marrow transplants. Those are adult stem cells. It's a rich source, but umbilical cord blood and the solid part of the cord and various other tissues have them. There are a couple of other types of stem cells we might mention as well. Fetal stem cells, which, as the term implies, you get from a fetus. You're still in the womb. Some of your cells have become a little more directed in terms of what they might become instead of the embryonic, which are basically going to form any type of tissue in the body. That's their job description at that point in your life. When you're a few days old, they're supposed to grow as fast as possible and start making every tissue. The adult stem cells are in various tissues of your body. The fetal cells are really that type of tissue stem cell. And then there's one other one I want to mention. It's called induced pluripotent stem cells, IPS cells for short, because it takes too long to talk about all of that. But pluripotent, as your listeners probably understand, there's a plurality of potential. They can form lots of different types of tissues. Embryonic stem cells are considered pluripotent. Now, because of some of the issues with embryonic stem cells, a Japanese scientist, Yamanaka, determined that he could actually make some cells into pluripotent stem cells simply by adding various genes. And we'll talk about why he went there, but the bottom line is that you can make a pluripotent cell from virtually any cell in the body, from any body. A skin cell, you can take just an ordinary skin cell and turn it into a stem cell. So there are lots of different sources, and they have different potentials, real potentials, in terms of what they might become.
That is a very helpful overview of all the different types of stem cell, fetal, embryonic, adult, and induced pluripotent. And that kind of leads us to our next myth or next question about how each of these are sourced. A lot of people, especially those who share our views about the value of human life, they might feel that they should oppose stem cell research altogether because what they've heard about how stem cells are sourced, they might believe that they can only be obtained through the destruction of fetal or embryonic life. And so, is that true?
And that's a resounding no. And it comes back to these various types of stem cells and their sources that we mentioned before. So we've already talked about embryonic stem cells, and you get those from a young human embryo, just a few days old. You have to literally destroy that young life to get the embryonic stem cells. And you destroy the embryo, you put her cells in the dish, and the hope is that that same potential they would show if you left that embryo intact and allowed her to develop normally, that the cells in the dish would show that same potential. Now, the potential is to make every type of bodily tissue, but what you find in the dish is you're missing all of those normal developmental cues that we have during those 9 months in the womb. And instead, what you get is what looks like a tumor in the dish. And in fact, if you inject those embryonic stem cells into an experimental animal, you tend to get tumors most of the time. In fact, it's one way that they use to test whether you have a pluripotent stem cell. You get a little tumor called a teratoma that'll have a few liver cells and some nerve cells, maybe a heart cell or so on, and they'll go, it's proof that it's pluripotent. Well, but you really wouldn't want to treat your patients with that because you don't want a tumor. You want controlled repair and regeneration of a particular tissue that's been damaged in the body. That's where the adult stem cells come in. Now, as we've mentioned, you can get adult stem cells anywhere along the way from birth onward. You can get them from the umbilical cord, from the blood and the solid part of the cord. But the main thing we want to focus on is that you don't have to destroy the donor. Embryonic stem cells, and frankly, fetal stem cells as well, both rely on destruction of a young human life. So there's a big X on there in terms of the ethics of getting those particular cells. Whereas with adult stem cells, you don't destroy the donor. In fact, in a lot of the transplants, which we'll discuss in a little bit, the donor is the patient themselves. And so you score positively, shall we say. Adult stem cells, ethically sourced, and it is a myth that your listeners need to be aware of, especially during the early days of the debates about stem cells. Everyone was pushing, it seemed like, for the most part, the scientists, embryonic stem cells. And the idea supposedly was you could make any tissue, and so we can, as one senator put it, cure all known maladies with embryonic stem cells. Now, there was no proof of that. And in fact, you still hear, oh, they have the potential. But the problem is to get those cells again, you have to destroy a young human life. Whereas the adult stem cells, the evidence is all on their side, not just in terms of the ethics and not having to harm or destroy the donor, but as we'll discuss in a moment, whether they really work or not.
Right. So there's important ethical considerations in how each of these types of stem cells are sourced, with significant concerns being mostly confined to just with the embryonic and the fetal stem cells. So I guess that leaves a lot of hope for the adult stem cells.
Yes.
But that kind of leads us to our third myth, which is that some people think that adult stem cells are not as useful in helping us understand and treat diseases. So, what are your thoughts on that potential misconception?
And again, that is definitely a myth. The evidence is actually all on the side of the adult stem cells. And we'll talk about a couple of different uses here. Now, a lot of times what we heard in terms of embryonic stem cells was, well, we only need a few, and so you're only going to have to destroy a few embryos, but that number kept going up and up and up and up. So you've still got, even if it was just one embryo, the unethical destruction of a human life. But this potential that kept being mentioned, it's been 25 years since human embryonic stem cells were first successfully grown in the laboratory. The number of successful cures and treatments for human beings with embryonic stem cells is still zero, the big goose egg. There is no published scientific evidence yet that any human being has been successfully cured with embryonic stem cells. And again, that's after 25 years of research. In fact, there's very little evidence that even any experimental animals have been helped with embryonic stem cells. One way to think about this is adult stem cells versus embryonic stem cells. It's the idea of live patients versus dead mice. The adult stem cells are the ones that actually do work. So we've already mentioned, number one, you can get them ethically without harming or destroying the donor. But number two, whereas that number was zero for number of human patients helped with embryonic stem cells, the last number I saw for adult stem cells was somewhere over 2 million people around the globe who've been helped with adult stem cells. Now, they may not be as flexible as embryonic or other pluripotent stem cells. And that's probably a good thing because, again, you don't want everything to be growing at once in your patient. You don't want a tumor. You may just want to grow beta cells so you can treat diabetes and those cells can secrete insulin. You might want to repair after a heart attack the damaged heart muscle or brain tissue after a stroke. You don't want liver growing in your brain. You don't want all of these other things growing all together as a tumor. You want specific regeneration and repair of tissues. And that's where adult stem cells have shown they're the gold standard. We'll mention later on a couple of resources that the listeners can check in on, but I want to lean on those and talk about some of the patients and some of the treatments that have been successful with adult stem cells. Again, zero efficacy with embryonic. With adult stem cells, a couple of million, give or take, patients who've been helped. And that's for things like heart damage. It's been documented that you can repair damaged heart muscle after a heart attack with adult stem cells. And it's not really sure how this works. In some cases, for a lot of these treatments, the adult stem cells might go in and transform themselves, differentiate themselves into the specific type of tissue that's been damaged. So they're going to replace damaged cells in the tissue. But there's also evidence that they go in and act more like a commander, a general that says, okay, you cells here, you're going to reform into new heart muscle tissue or new neurons and so on. I mentioned stroke, and there's already a number of papers that show damage repaired after a stroke with adult stem cells. We document this on a website that we'll provide to the listeners later. But Sonia Kuntz is one example of a specific patient that we document. Sonia had a stroke as a young adult and had some paralysis on one side with her limbs, had problems with her gait, obviously, had some speech problems. And it was bad enough that she was embarrassed. She didn't want to actually go through a wedding ceremony with her fiance. Well, she got enrolled in a clinical trial where they took some adult stem cells from bone marrow and injected into the specific part of the brain where the stroke damage was. Not very long after that treatment, Sonia started using her limbs. She was raising her arm where she couldn't do it before. Now, it's not a complete cure. And I think we need to be cautious about using that C word, cure, with a lot of these treatments. Yet, Sonia recovered her gait, recovered use of her limbs. Her speech is much improved. She went ahead and got married. She now has 2 kids as well. So the adult stem cells are working very well with her. I mentioned before bone marrow transplants as adult stem cells. In fact, usually a lot of the formerly called bone marrow transplant centers are called stem cell transplant centers now. All of those stem cells that are used, again, are adult stem cells. It might be from bone marrow, it might be from umbilical cord blood, the solid cord. There are even a few that use liposuction fat. It turns out that's actually a source, and I'm excited about that because I can serve as a donor for that one. But they've used these cells in dozens of different conditions. Instead of the old, you can only use them to treat leukemias or certain types of anemias or cancers, and they've done yeoman service there. There are other conditions now, including genetic conditions, where they're starting to use adult stem cells. We profiled one of the patients who had, past tense, sickle cell anemia. Desiree had lived her whole life up to she was 20, I think, when she got her transplant with the pain because she had very severe sickle cell. And it's a genetic condition, so now the patient can't serve as their own donor. So they had donated umbilical cord blood, adult stem cells. Desiree got that transplant and she doesn't have sickle cell anemia anymore. Now you have to get a good match, and that's why cord blood is often used in those type of transplants, because you don't actually have to have an exact match in terms of the tissue types. You just have to get close. There's a couple of recent studies where they can actually get success using what's called a half match, a haplotype match, and still get good results, and not just with young people, but even with mature adults in terms of these transplants. So they're expanding accessibility. There's another genetic condition that we profiled where adult stem cells helped. Little Reagan Moore was born with Krabbe syndrome. Now, it's a neurological genetic condition. In fact, most of these little kids don't live beyond 2 years old. She was born in a state where they were actually checking for that condition at birth, and she was diagnosed at birth. They did an umbilical cord blood adult stem cell transplant soon after her birth. Again, not a cure, but Reagan turned 6 and started school not too long ago. Again, a good result with the adult stem cells. They're starting to use them for lots of other conditions. I mentioned juvenile diabetes, and there have been some studies that show that adult stem cells can work there. Liver diseases. There have even been several studies now where they're starting to use a very specific donation of adult stem cells to treat HIV and completely remove the virus from the patient's system. So the list goes on, and I get excited about talking about these because there's so much success. But again, 0 success versus over 2 million people alive, health improved with adult stem cells. I think there's a pretty clear difference between the two.
It's all very exciting, very, very powerful stories. And so it seems like people get excited about embryonic stem cells because of theoretically they are more flexible. You can mold them into anything, but maybe, it seems like that's turning out to be more of a challenge for them compared to the adult stem cells. And so the very encouraging stories there are proof of that. That's all extremely good to know. Before we close out, Dr. Prentice, would you mind? You mentioned some resources that our listeners could find useful potentially. Could you tell us more about those?
There are 2 main ones I want to mention. The primary one, I keep talking about these patients that we've profiled. We profiled them, did some video interviews to let them tell their own story And the website is stemcellresearchfacts.org. And the other reference that I'd like to provide for your listeners is I did a brief review on the different types of stem cells and their uses just a few years ago. It was published in Circulation Research, thoroughly referenced and so on, but I'll provide the link to that reference, which is open access for you so that the listeners can check that out as well.
That's great. And yeah, we'll put the links in the show notes. We love open access resources. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Prentice, for coming on and sharing all those insights.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Thanks so much for getting the good news of adult stem cells out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much to our listeners for joining us today as well. Hope you liked this episode. If you did, be sure to give us a like on YouTube and a subscribe on YouTube. And if you're listening via podcast app, maybe give us a 5-star review there. That would be really helpful to help us get these episodes to reach more people. And we will see you on our next episode.